The waters of the Tigris River did not run clear in the winter of 1258. History tells us they ran with two distinct, horrifying colors. First, the river turned black, choked with the ink of a million manuscripts, the dissolved wisdom of centuries of human thought thrown into the water by conquerors who had no use for poetry or algebra. Then, the river turned red. The ink was washed away by the blood of hundreds of thousands of scholars, poets, merchants, and children. This was the end of the golden age of Islam. It was the moment when the intellectual center of the world, the city of peace, was erased from the map with a violence so absolute that the region would not fully recover for another 700 years. But amidst the slaughter of the masses and the burning of libraries, one specific event stood out as a calculated piece of theater designed to freeze the blood of kings across the known world. It was the fate of the caliph and his family. What happened to the royal house of the Abbasids was not merely an execution. It was a message. It was a meticulously staged warning that the old rules of sovereignty, divinity, and mercy no longer apply. A new power had arrived from the east, and it did not care for the sanctity of crowns. To understand the sheer weight of this catastrophe, we must first understand the victim. In the middle of the 13th century, Baghdad was not just a city, it was an idea. It was the heir to Babylon and Nineveh, a metropolis of nearly 1 million souls where the streets were paved with tar and the gardens loomed with exotic flowers brought from the edges of the earth. At its heart sat the Caliph al-Mustasim Billah. As the 37th Caliph of the Abbasid dynasty, he was considered by the Sunni world to be the shadow of God on earth, the commander of the faithful, and the spiritual leader of the entire Islamic Ummah. His lineage stretched back over 5 centuries. To the people of Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate was as permanent as the mountains or the stars. It was an institution that had weathered internal revolts, palace coups, and foreign incursions. There was a belief, deeply roughly hewn into the psyche of the court, that if the caliph were ever harmed, the universe itself would rebel. The sun would hide its face, the rains would cease, and the earth would swallow the aggressors. This spiritual arrogance created a fatal blindness. Al-Mustasim was a man more interested in bird-keeping and court intrigue than in the maintenance of his walls or the payment of his soldiers. He was surrounded by advisors who whispered sweet lies into his ears, telling him that the name of Baghdad alone was enough to deter any enemy. He reduced the size of his army to save money, trusting that the entire Muslim world would rise up to defend him if he were ever truly threatened. He believed his own myth. He believed that he was untouchable. But while al-Mustasim sat on his pearl-encrusted throne, a storm was gathering on the steppes of Mongolia that cared nothing for his lineage or his theology. The Mongol Empire, founded by Genghis Khan, had become the largest contiguous land empire in history. Now, under the rule of the great Khan Monka, a new mandate had been issued. The Mongols were expanding westward again. The task was given to Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis and the brother of Monka. Hulagu was not a raider looking for loot. He was a kingmaker and a king-breaker, tasked with bringing the Middle East into the Mongol fold. His orders were simple but terrifyingly precise. Destroy the assassins in their mountain fortresses, subjugate the caliph in Baghdad, and push on to Syria and Egypt. Those who submitted would be spared and taxed. Those who resisted would be annihilated. The Mongol war machine that descended upon the Middle East was unlike anything the Abbasids had ever seen. It was a disciplined, multi-ethnic juggernaut. It included not just the peerless Mongol cavalry, but also thousands of Chinese engineers who were masters of siegecraft, Armenian and Georgian Christian auxiliaries eager to strike at the heart of Islamic power, and seasoned generals who had fought from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian. Hulagu moved with a terrifying deliberation. He did not rush. He systematically dismantled the Nizari Ismailis, the feared order of assassins, Krushi, ends of their supposedly impregnable castles like eggshells. This should have been the final warning to Baghdad. The assassins were feared by everyone, yet they had been extinguished in a matter of months. When Hulagu turned his eyes toward Baghdad, he offered the caliph one chance. He demanded submission. He demanded that al-Mustasim tear down the city walls, fill in the moats, and come in person to the Mongol camp to pledge his allegiance. It was a humiliation, certainly, but it was an offer of survival. The caliph's response was a study in delusion. He sent a letter back to Hulagu that was a mix of bluster and insult. He warned the Mongol warlord that if he attacked Baghdad, the wrath of God would consume him. He called Hulagu young and ignorant. It was the letter of a man who did not know. He was already dead. Hulagu did not send an angry reply. He simply ordered his armies to march. In January of 1258, the citizens of Baghdad looked out from their walls and saw the horizon darken. The Mongol army, numbering perhaps 150,000 men, fanned out around the city in a perfect crescent. They set up a perimeter that was watertight. No food would enter, no one would leave. The Chinese engineers set to work constructing massive siege engines, catapults capable of hurling palm trees and massive stones. They dug ditches and built palisades, effectively building a prison around the city before the first arrow was even fired. The siege itself was short and brutal. For all the glory of Baghdad, its defenses had been neglected. The caliph's reduced army marched out to meet the Mongols and was utterly destroyed. The Mongols broke dikes along the river, flooding the ground behind the Abbasid troops, trapping them in the mud where they were slaughtered. Within days, the siege engines were pounding the walls. The noise was deafening, a constant thunder that shook the foundations of the palaces. Panic began to spread through the streets. The realization dawned on the populace that the caliph had no plan, no allies were coming, and the end was near. By early February, the Mongols had breached the walls. They did not storm the city immediately. They waited. They let the terror ripen. Al-Mustasim, finally realizing the magnitude of his error, tried to negotiate. He sent envoys offering vast amounts of gold. Hulagu refused to see them. The time for talk had passed. Said weeks ago. The caliph had gambled with the lives of 1 million people and lost. Now he had to pay the wager. On February 10th, the Caliph al-Mustasim Billah, the commander of the faithful, walked out of the city gates to surrender. He was accompanied by his 3 sons and 3,000 of the city's dignitaries, judges, and scholars. They walked into the Mongol camp hoping for mercy, hoping that the dignity of their office would grant them some reprieve. They were separated immediately. The dignitaries were led away out of sight and systematically beheaded. The caliph and his family were kept under guard, forced to watch as the final act of the tragedy began. Hulagu gave the order to sack the city. What followed was a week of violence so extreme that it traumatized the historical consciousness of the region. The Mongols swept through Baghdad like a fire. They did not just loot, they erased. The House of Wisdom, the greatest library in the world, containing translations of Plato and Aristotle, medical texts, astronomical charts, and the accumulated knowledge of the Greek, Persian, and Indian worlds, was destroyed. The books were ripped apart for their leather covers or simply thrown into the river. The scholars who had maintained this knowledge were cut down where they stood. The mosques, the palaces, the hospitals, and the markets were pillaged and burned. The civilian population was hunted. The Mongols had a quota system for slaughter. Soldiers were often required to bring a certain number of severed heads to their commanders to prove they had done their duty. Women, children, the old and the sick, none were spared. The streets became impassable due to the piles of corpses. The smell of death became so overpowering that eventually the Mongols themselves would have to move their camp upwind to escape the stench of their own handiwork. But amidst this holocaust, Hulagu had a specific problem to solve regarding the caliph. The Mongols had their own superstitions. Under their laws, the Yasa, it was considered a bad omen to spill royal blood upon the earth. They believed that the spirit of a king resided in his blood, and to let it touch the ground would offend the sky god Tengri and bring misfortune upon the executioner. However, the caliph had to die. He could not be left alive to serve as a rallying point for a future rebellion. He had to be removed. But he had to be removed in a way that adhered to the Mongol code of honor, however twisted that code might seem to the victims. Hulagu ordered the caliph to be brought before him. He taunted al-Mustasim, showing him the vast treasures that the caliph had hoarded in his palace. Hulagu asked him why he had not used this gold to pay his soldiers or to strengthen his walls. He asked why he had not melted down the gold to make arrowheads. The caliph, starving and terrified, could only reply that it was the will of God. Hulagu, with a cold smile, replied that what was about to happen to him was also the will of God. The method of execution chosen for the last Abbasid caliph was unique, brutal, and deeply symbolic. It was designed to mock the caliph's softness and to ensure that the Mongol taboo against spilling royal blood was respected. Al-Mustasim was wrapped in a carpet. Some accounts say it was one of his own rich Persian rugs, a symbol of the luxury that had made him weak. Once he was rolled up tight, like a piece of baggage, the bundle was placed on the ground. Then the Mongol cavalry was summoned. Hardened warriors, men who had spent their lives in the saddle, rode their horses over the carpet. They trampled the caliph to death. It was a slow, crushing end. There was no sword, no clean cut, no drop of blood touching the soil. The shadow of God on earth was reduced to pulp beneath the hooves of foreign ponies. It was an ignoble, suffocating death, a complete negation of his status. He was not treated as a holy man or a warrior king. He was treated as an obstruction to be flattened. This fate was not reserved solely for the caliph. His sons were also executed, ensuring that the lineage was severed. The capture of the royal family was total. One son was reportedly spared, but sent to Mongolia to live as a prisoner, married to a Mongol woman, Sotha. His children would be Mongols, effectively breeding the Abbasid line out of existence. The daughters of the caliph were distributed among the Mongol commanders as slaves for their harems. The royal house, which had stood for 500 years, was not just defeated. It was dismantled, humiliated, and scattered. The brutality of this execution was calculated. Hulagu knew that the eyes of the woe were watching. He knew that to the west, the Mamluks of Egypt were observing. To the north, the Christian kings of Europe were waiting for news. To the east, the remnants of the Persian Empire were trembling. By killing the caliph in such a total and ritualistic manner, Hulagu was sending a warning that no status, no religion, and no history could protect a ruler who defied the Mongol Khan. It was a declaration that the old world order was dead. The Mongols were the new arbiters of life and death, and their judgment was absolute. The psychological impact of the caliph's death cannot be overstated. When news spread that the commander of the faithful had been trampled in a rug, and that Baghdad was a smoking ruin, a wave of apocalyptic despair swept through the Muslim world. It seemed as though the end times had arrived. Prayers were said in mosques from Cordoba to Delhi for a caliph who no longer existed. The psychological anchor of the Sunni world had been ripped away. However, this warning served a dual purpose. It was also a message to the other powers in the region. When Hulagu marched towards Syria, cities that might have resisted threw open their gates. Rulers of Minor States rushed to offer tribute, terrified that they too would be rolled in carpets and trampled. The terror of Baghdad paved the road for the Mongol advance. It was psychological warfare perfected. The sheer scale of the atrocity was the weapon. It forced capitulation through the paralysis of fear. Yet there is a profound irony in the legacy of this event. The warning was received, but it also galvanized the only force capable of stopping the Mongols. The Mamluks of Egypt, a caste of slave soldiers, saw what happened in Baghdad. They realized that there could be no negotiation with the Mongols. Submission meant slavery or death. Resistance meant death or victory. There was no middle ground. When Hulagu sent envoys to Cairo demanding submission, threatening to do to Egypt what he had done to Baghdad, the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz did not hesitate. He executed the Mongol envoys and hung their heads from the gates of Cairo. This defiance was born directly from the ashes of Baghdad. The Mamluks knew that the caliph's strategy of appeasement and bluffing had led to his extermination. They chose the opposite path. This led to the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, just 2 years after the fall of Baghdad. There, for the first time, the Mongol juggernaut was halted and defeated. The spell of Mongol invincibility was broken. But the Mamluks fought with the desperation of men who had seen the warning written in the blood of the Abbasids. They fought because they knew the alternative was the carpet and the hooves. The destruction of Baghdad's royal family remains a stark lesson in the fragility of power. Al-Mustasim believed his position was divinely protected, that his legacy was armor enough against the swords of the steppe. He failed to understand the changing world around him. He failed to see that a new age had dawned. an age of steel and efficiency that had no reverence for the past. The Mongols, in their ruthless pragmatism, demonstrated that civilization is not a guarantee. It is a construct that must be defended, constantly and vigorously. The image of the caliph wrapped in that rug is one of history's most haunting tableaus. It represents the collision of two worlds, the sedentary, sophisticated, and decaying world of the Abbasids against the mobile, ruthless, and ascendi world of the Mongols. It was the moment when the sanctity of bloodlines clashed with the reality of force. In the end, the river Tigris eventually ran clear again. The survivors returned. Baghdad was rebuilt, though it remained a shadow of its former self, a provincial outpost rather than the center of the world. But the warning issued by Hulagu echoed through the centuries. It taught the world that when a civilization becomes too arrogant to defend itself, when its leaders retreat into fantasy and ignore the gathering storm, the fall is not just possible, it is inevitable. And when that fall comes, it does not respect titles, crowns, or prayers. The Mongols did not just kill a king, they killed the assumption of safety. They proved that even the most sacred figures could be crushed into the dirt, leaving nothing behind but a warning to those who would come after, submit, or perish. The silence that fell over Baghdad in the spring of 1258 was the silence of a lesson learned too late, a silence that still whispers to us from the pages of High Story, reminding us that no golden age is immortal, and no dynasty is safe from the turning wheel of time.